Good afternoon and welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Glad to have you along for another edition of Tales from the Vault. It's our collaborative program with the Illinois State Museum and the Abraham Lincoln National Historic Home Site with the National Park Service. Glad to have you along on this early part of March as we celebrate Women's History Month with a special program featuring the women of the Lincoln family from Springfield to Hildene. And to tell you all about it and share some amazing artifacts from our collection, please welcome our ALPLM Lincoln Historian, McWhirter.
Thank you, everybody. This is a real treat for me. I've always been fascinated by particularly the descendants of Abraham Lincoln, and I've never really had a chance to dig into a lot of this stuff. So this was a really interesting program for me to look into. I mean, for those of you who don't know, there are no direct descendants of Abraham Lincoln left. The last direct descendant of Abraham Lincoln was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, and he passed away in 1985. So since 1985, there are no direct descendants of Abraham Lincoln. But he and his sister Peggy, who's the baby in that picture, donated much of the family's, especially their papers and their photographs, to this institution. They ended up in a couple other places too, including Hildene, which is where they lived and is still a historic site you can visit, which I'm going to visit in June. I've never been there before, so I'm very excited to finally see it for myself. So a lot of the objects you're going to see today actually come directly from the last generation of Lincolns. So it was just a real treat for me to really dig into that stuff because I haven't before. And so I got carried away. So a lot of what they gave us was documents and photographs. So you're going to see the closer we get in time to our present moment, it's going to be much more paper heavy. And I'm going to show, I didn't bring any of the photographs with me. I'm going to show you a bunch of them. And so we'll see if we get through everything. And we'll get through all these ladies, though. We're going to talk about 8 ladies today over 5 generations. We're going to go from Lincoln's mother, Nancy, to Peggy, which is going to take us from the late 18th century to 1975. So let's get going right away, because, I want to make sure we have time for everything. So I said we have a lot of photographs, but of course we only have a lot of photographs of the later Lincoln women, starting with Mary Todd. We're not going to spend a lot of time on Mary Todd today because I think we talk about Mary Todd a lot, but I do have a couple very cool Mary Todd things we're going to show. But the first Lincoln we're going to talk about is Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the mother of Abraham Lincoln. So we don't know what she looked like. There are no photographs of Nancy Hanks Lincoln. There is a picture, if you Google Nancy Hanks Lincoln, a portrait will come up. That is not a real portrait. That is somebody's guess as to what she looked like. So I always put that disclaimer out there because I think a lot of people think that is an actual portrait, and it is not. We don't know what she looked like. And in fact, accounts differ. Some describe her as being very slight, and some describe her as being the opposite. And maybe both are true depending on what time of her life you knew her, right? We don't know. We also don't know when she was born. There's conjecture as to when she was born, but we don't know. She was from Virginia. She was part of that wave of settlers that pushed into Kentucky, which is, of course, where she meets Thomas Lincoln and marries Thomas Lincoln in 1806. She is routinely described by, some of you, I'm sure, because you've all heard me, or some of you have heard me give these talks before, a lot of what we know about her comes from the interviews William Herndon did for his biography of Abraham Lincoln, right? He was Lincoln's last law partner, and after Lincoln dies, he goes out and interviews all these people who knew Lincoln, and these oral histories all become his biography of Lincoln. Those interviews are all compiled in a book called Herndon's Informants, and that's where we learn a lot of this from those interviews. Everyone who talks about Nancy describes her as being intelligent and kind, including Abraham Lincoln himself. One thing I want to emphasize, though, even going back to Nancy, there is discussion of a kind of sadness. And over this deep dive that I did into these women, looking at their papers and these kind of things, really cemented for me something that we've long said about this family. Clearly, some kind of clinical depression runs throughout this family. Every one of these women show symptomology of some kind of depression of some kind. Of course, we can't really diagnose people of the past, but that appears to have been evident in Nancy as well. There's a lot of controversy about Nancy's, her own ancestry. Her mother, Lucy, reportedly had her out of wedlock and was apparently charged with fornication. But again, we don't know a lot of details about this. And of course, she moves to Indiana in 1816 with Thomas and her two children, Abraham and Sarah, who we'll talk about Sarah. We're not really going to talk about Abraham very much, but we'll talk about Sarah in a moment. And of course, Nancy tragically passes away in 1818. And so this is her grave at the Lincoln Boyhood Home site in Indiana. It is still there. If you have not been to the Lincoln Boyhood site, it is a wonderful site. I visited it the day after everything closed down due to COVID, so I was the only person they had that day, and I got to walk around there all by myself. And it is so that was really gave me a peek into maybe what it was like. And this is, they eventually give her a larger monument. But so you can see the older one is right behind it, although it's obviously being kept up. This is an interesting document I found that I have not looked into yet, so I don't know how legit it is. But this is a letter that a man named Christopher Columbus Graham sent to Robert Todd Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's only surviving child. Robert's going to play a big role in this whole presentation. On January 14th, 1885. And he is writing Robert to tell him that that he witnessed Nancy and Thomas's marriage. I am this day 100 years, 3 months, and 4 days old, having been born October 10th, 1784. I am the only surviving witness of the marriage of your grandfather Thomas Lincoln and your grandmother Nancy Hanks, by that sterling businessman and good Methodist preacher, Jesse Head. Interesting. I thought this was an interesting letter for a couple reasons. Obviously, if it's true, it's interesting, but also seeing Robert also engaging, right? The Lincolns, the Lincoln men especially, Abraham and Robert, are both very interested in their own ancestry. And so that Robert had this letter and kept it, I think is interesting and tells you a little bit about Robert. But of course, as you all know, Nancy, after she passes away, Thomas Lincoln marries again, and he marries Sarah Bush Lincoln, who we do have a photograph of. She was born on December 13th, 1788, and passed away on December 10th, 1869. She had rejected Thomas Lincoln's first marriage proposal and married Daniel Johnson instead, with whom she has 3 children who come with her to live with the Lincolns in Indiana. She's 30 when she marries Thomas in 1819. She herself is interviewed by Hildene. And if you're interested in her, I highly recommend you read that interview. A lot of what we know about her comes from that interview she does herself. She talks about Abraham going to see her right before he goes away to be president, and she says she thought she would never see him again. It's a really poignant, really moving interview. So I recommend it's real treasure that we actually have her words in that interview, because as you saw with Nancy, when you go this far back, and these aren't, one of the themes I should have drawn to begin with too is the trajectory of this family, right? Like, so when we get to Mary Harlan and the last Lincolns, like, compare their lifestyle to these women's lifestyle, right? I mean, it's astounding what happens to this family over 5 generations and where they end up, right? And that's what we don't, like, Nancy and Sarah are both illiterate, for instance. Or at least we believe they are, or maybe at best partly literate. She, like Nancy, is extremely highly regarded by her neighbors. They talk about her in very positive terms. She arrives in Indiana and immediately cleans up the Lincoln homestead, and she remains a very kind of steady parent and wife to Thomas, Abraham, and Sarah Lincoln. She, of course, outlives her son, as I said, and he visits her. This is the only photo we have of her. I brought a document for her. Again, we don't have much to remember her by. I brought a document for her as well. This is a borrowed document in our collections. It's a loan. And Sarah here, and I'll make sure it's out when you're done, but Sarah here signs her name with an X. So I mentioned illiterate. Here she is not knowing how to sign her own name. Nevertheless, and when Lincoln himself talks about Nancy and Sarah, it's often hard to tell which one he's talking about. It's clear that both those women inspire Lincoln's love of learning. So even though they may have been illiterate, there's obviously some intellectual curiosity in that family. Of course, Thomas, we won't get into Thomas today, but Thomas, there's all kinds of controversy over what kind of a man Thomas was. But it's clear that both mothers are very encouraging to Lincoln, to Abraham Lincoln, and recognize his intellect. So that is the first generation of Lincolns. The second generation, unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of the second generation. Sarah, or Sally, as she was known, Abraham Lincoln's sister. Sally was born on February 10th, 1807, and she tragically passes away on January 20th, 1828. She is Abraham Lincoln's older sister, and when Nancy passes away, Sally is 11 years old. And Thomas, right there in Indiana, Thomas leaves Indiana to go to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and leaves Abraham and Sally on their own. So Sally, at 11, is running the Lincoln household in Indiana. This continually boggles my mind that these two children are alone on the frontier. I mean, there are people around them, but they are living absolutely, in recently kind of carved out, a recently carved out white settlement together. When Sarah arrives, their stepmother arrives, there are descriptions that the Lincolns, that Abraham and Sally are, almost like feral because they've been living on their own for months in that home. She marries Aaron Grigsby, who lives nearby, on August 2nd, 1826, and then 2 years later tragically dies during childbirth, and the child itself is also stillborn. And so that's why all we know of her is her gravestone. This gravestone, along with Nancy's, is Nancy's grave is on the site where the Lincoln boyhood homestead is in Indiana. Sarah is buried nearby in a cemetery, and her grave is still there. I visited it when I went to that site. People put pennies on it because of her brother. What I brought for them, I brought for Sally and actually Sarah Bush Lincoln. So Little Pigeon Creek is the community where they live. This is the Baptist Church Minute Book, the actual Baptist Church Minute Book from Little Pigeon Creek. And the membership of both Sarah and Sally is recorded in this book. So the bottom here is June the 7th, 1823. It says right here, Brother Thomas Lincoln, by letter, and this is him being admitted to the church. And then if you turn the page, at the top of, it's the same date, but it just spills over on the next page, is Sarah Bush, and they don't even know her name. It says, and Sister Blank Lincoln of Thomas. So they never actually filled in her first name. In April of 26 is where Sally shows up. It says right at the bottom, Sally Lincoln, again, by the, although Lincoln, they spell it right this time. They spell Lincoln right. So she's right here. And then someone, you'll see Sally Lincoln, someone has written here in pencil. They didn't do that. Probably somebody subsequently did that. So, also, I'm sure you all knew this walking in, but notice we already have a theme of tragedy with these women and with this family. Not only do they all suffer probably from some kind of mental illness, there is always, to not be too poetic about, or to be too poetic about, the specter of death haunts this family, right? And so we're already seeing some of that tragedy built into their stories. So now the one we all know, Mary. So Mary was born on December 13th, 1818. She passes away on July 16th, 1882. She marries Abraham Lincoln in 1842. This is where the Lincoln family levels up. Mary is from a well-to-do slaveholding Kentucky family. She is very politically connected. Her father is a politician. They know the Clays, Henry Clay. And in marrying her, Abraham Lincoln is moving dramatically up in society. Not that Lincoln gets some kind of huge dowry or anything. It's not one of those deals, but it definitely allows him to kind of enter the closest thing to an aristocracy. And Mary knows it. And Mary very much comports herself like someone who comes from one of those families. Mary also breaks the trend we've seen so far of education, right? Mary is highly educated. Mary goes to several schools in Lexington. She is far more educated than Abraham Lincoln, who has less than a year of formal schooling, which would have been the same for Sally, by the way. Sally and Abraham went to school together. One of the reasons Abraham Lincoln is so taken with Mary, because Mary is extremely well educated and well read. She can speak French. She's exceptionally well educated. So this is the earliest photograph we have of Mary. There's no photograph of her and Abraham together, but they took these at the same time. The youngest picture of Abraham Lincoln and the youngest picture of Mary Lincoln are both taken in 46 after he's elected to Congress. So it's their kind of, so they go and get professional photos made because now they're a rising political family. Here she is with the boys. And she, of course, has 4 children, Robert, Eddie, Willie, and Tad. And, of course, as you, I'm sure, all know, all but Robert pass away. Tad outlives Abraham, and, of course, she witnesses the death of her husband by assassination. The artifacts we have from Mary, I selected in part to illustrate what a change we see in this family. The first object is that diamond necklace. So that is a diamond heart-shaped necklace. It's one of the prizes of our collection, and it belonged to Mary Lincoln. Depending on who you listen to, it may have been a gift from Abraham Lincoln. We actually get that necklace through a cousin of Peggy, who we'll talk about at the end. And so she's kind of where we get the story from. But it certainly belonged to Mary, and it's obviously, very expensive for that time, very delicate necklace. So you can imagine it shows Mary's personal style. It's probably from the presidential or very close to the presidential years. And it shows how much, how far this family has come and how Mary is comporting herself. The other object we have, now you've probably all seen, if you've been to the museum, you've probably all seen that necklace we put on display all the time. The next object we very rarely put out. So this is kind of the real crown jewel of what we're doing here. That is Mary's strawberry dress. It is the dress she is wearing in this photograph. It's from the presidential years. We don't know how she got it. It was probably at least altered by Elizabeth Keckley, because that would have been when Keckley was working for Mary Lincoln. And it's the real deal. It's extremely fragile, so we don't bring it out a lot. But it's one of the rare, Mary, there's all this controversy around Mary that she sells a bunch of her dresses, and a bunch of them get given away, a bunch of them end up with the descendants, and Mary's clothes all get scattered hither and yon. There aren't that many, though, that actually survive, or if they are out there, we don't know about them. So this is one of the rare cases where we have a complete dress of Mary's, but also it's the only instance in which we have a photograph of her wearing that exact dress. So this letter is from Mary, and it is from very late in her life. This is in October 23rd, 1881. Mary is in New York City. I'm not going to read it to you because it would take too long, but basically this is Mary. She has gone to New York, and she is undergoing a kind of spa, kind of electric treatment because she has pain in her legs. So this is very near the end. This is another theme that runs through this family. These women all get very concerned about their health later in life. Now, in some ways, this is unremarkable. These are people living at a time when there isn't the same level of professional medicine we have now, so of course they're concerned about their health because their health deteriorates faster than ours does because they don't have the same medical care. But it definitely runs through their letters that there's a preoccupation with their health, and Mary has that too. And she's very sad in this letter. She's at this point, she's come back to live here in Springfield. This is after her time in an insane asylum and all this kind of stuff. The last meeting she has with Robert, where he comes to see her here and they kind of reconcile, that has happened already, but she's still angry at him about all that. So it's a pretty sad letter. A lot of what happens in this letter is she's complaining about how she's kind of homeless and adrift. So again, very sad letter from Mary, which is kind of a key part of her story. Okay. So these are two letters from Robert, and what they are is they're about this painting. So the White House, the Coolidges, realize that there is no portrait of Mary Lincoln in the White House. And so they ask the Lincolns for one. They reach out to Robert. They actually reach out to Mary Harlan. But of course, Robert ends up being the one to do the correspondence because that's how things worked back then. So these are the retained family copies of those letters, where they are donating this painting to the White House. This painting hangs in the White House now. It was painted by Catherine Helm, who is Mary's niece. I don't think it's a great likeness of Mary, but that's just me. But it was interesting to me to see this correspondence between Coolidge and Robert. So this is Robert on December 31st, 1925, writing, "Dear Mr. President, I am just in receipt of your very kind letter of the 29th instant, and it is indeed gratifying to me to know that the portrait of my mother has been so graciously accepted by the government and is to find a permanent place in the White House, where it still hangs." I actually lifted this image from the White House Historical Society's website. "Please accept my sincere thanks both for your kind offices in the matter and for your cordial letter." So, and this is Coolidge to Robert. I think this is actually before that letter, right? December 29th. "Dear Mr. Lincoln, I must add to the formal expressions of gratitude which accompany the acceptance of a gift to the government my warm personal thanks to you for the portrait of your mother. Any remembrance which touches so closely to the life of President Lincoln is a precious heritage of the American people," and on and on. So these are typed, of course. This is, once we get typewriters, these letters get less interesting to look at. But there's Robert's retained copy again. Of course, the actual letters are, this would be in the Coolidge papers, and then get rid of that. And then there's the Coolidge letter. Again, it's a copy, signed Calvin Coolidge. And it's always interesting to me, too. So another theme I want to draw out, now that we're getting past Abraham and Mary, is legacy. So all these descendants now are all going to have to deal with Abraham Lincoln's legacy in one way or another, right? The most famous American and the greatest American president, or who most people think is the greatest American president, is their descendant. And they all deal with it in very different ways. Robert spends his whole life kind of grappling with that. These women all deal with it in very different ways. And it's kind of interesting to see how they do it, because it's a lot to bear. I think for some of them it may have been too much, and they kind of reject it, as you'll see. So Mary Harlan marries Robert. Mary Harlan was born on September 25th, 1846. She passed away on March 31st, 1937. She is from Mount Pleasant, Iowa. She is the daughter of James Harlan, a Republican senator from Iowa. Mary Todd, again, we don't like to call her Mary Todd Lincoln here, but we're going to do that because otherwise I can't tell them apart, right? So Mary Todd Lincoln actually introduced, because she never went by Mary Todd Lincoln. For those of you who don't know, that's why we don't like to call her that. But Mary Todd actually fixes her up with Robert, or at least we believe so. She is very enamored of Mary Harlan herself. I guess they meet each other probably at like a ball that they attend shortly before Lincoln's second inaugural, and then they sit next to each other. Robert and Mary Harlan sit next to each other at the second inaugural. And Robert is apparently quite smitten with her. She's, again, exceptional. We're in the stratosphere of American culture with these people. So, she's exceptionally well educated. The family is very conservative. She, as is Robert, or very well educated, conservative. Robert, of course, is fairly conservative, goes to Harvard, so also very well educated. They get married in 1868. One of the things her father is known for is he's the guy who kicks Walt Whitman out of the Department of the Interior, which is a sign of, I think, his cultural conservatism. Much like her mother-in-law, who she eventually has a very bad relationship with. She eventually kind of cuts Mary right out of her life. She won't see Mary. Mary Todd, again, I gotta be careful so you know which one I'm talking about. There's 4 Marys here, but fortunately the other Marys all pick different names and go by different names, so we won't have this confusion after we marry Harlan. Mary Todd, if you go by Mary Harlan's story, after Mary Harlan's first child, Mamie, who we will talk about in a moment, is born, Mary Todd, their relationship immediately falls apart because Mary Todd, according to Mary Harlan, becomes very overbearing about the way she thinks Mary Harlan is raising her children. And over time, that separation grows more and more. Eventually, she doesn't want her in their house anymore. She still allows Mary Todd to see the children. They have like a nanny. And so she will send the nanny with the kids over to visit Mary Todd. And eventually that ends too, because Mary Todd starts apparently bad-mouthing the way Mary Harlan raises those kids in front of them to the nanny, and then Mary Harlan eventually cuts that off too. So again, more tragedy for the Lincolns, and a difficult relationship between the two of them, even though originally she was Mary Todd's choice. Like her mother-in-law, she seems to have suffered from chronic poor health. She is always sick in one way or another. She's very fragile, and she writes about it constantly in her letters. She has 3 children. Mamie is the oldest, who we'll talk about in a moment. Abraham Lincoln II, who goes by Jack, who, in keeping with the Lincoln tradition, passes away at a young age. He, similar to Willie, it's very similar to Willie's story, where apparently he's exceptionally bright, and everybody loves Jack, and unfortunately he dies at a young age. And she stays with him, much like her mother-in-law. She stays at his bedside that entire time. Robert Todd Lincoln actually writes a letter to John Hay, Lincoln's secretary. It's interesting to see all these people, how they stay in touch after the Lincoln story, right? We always end the Lincoln story in 1865. It's interesting to see how these people continue, praising her for how well she keeps it together during that tragedy. They live in Chicago for most of their marriage, but eventually they build the mansion in Hildene in Vermont, which we'll get some photographs of in a moment. In 1904, they permanently moved there in 1912, and that will become a big part of the story as well. They also have a winter home in Georgetown. Robert dies on July 26, 1926. He and Mary are both supposed to be buried, Mary Harlan, are both supposed to be buried here in the Lincoln tomb. Jack is already here. Mary Harlan decides 16 days after Robert's death that he shouldn't come here, that he should be buried in Arlington because he was an officer in the Union Army and he needs his own place in the sun. And so that's where Robert is buried. Robert is not here in the tomb. He is in Arlington, and she ends up buried with him, and they move Jack out there. So the other thing about her and about all these women is they get really into Christian Science. And that kind of becomes a thing with the will, because when she dies, she has a will. This is the other picture I have, by the way, of her. This is her wedding portrait. When she dies, she stipulates in her will that all her money should be left to, that once there are no remaining Lincolns to inherit any money, which she doesn't know that's going to happen, but of course it happens, that all her money, all the Lincolns' trust money should be donated to the American Red Cross, Iowa Wesleyan College, which is where one of her daughters will go to school, and the First Church of Christian Science. Here's Hildene. Here it is in the winter. I thought this was a pretty shot. Again, these are all their photos, right? Again, these are the Lincoln family's photos that they gave to us. Mamie gets a Kodak camera. A lot of these photos are, Mamie takes these herself with her Kodak camera. Here's their Georgetown home. And then here are her kids. So Mamie, who's actually Mary, right? There's always a Mary. So this is Mary, who goes by Mamie, Jack, Abraham, and then Jesse. Couple of artifacts for, again, to show how this family, how far they've come. We have a lot of fans in our collection from Hildene that we were able to, with some help, determine post-date Mary Todd Lincoln, so they were Mary Harlan's. So this is one of those fans. It's beautiful, yeah, really intricate. And then we also have a lot of Mary Harlan's china, much of which is actually on display in the governor's mansion right now. But this is a platter from that set. It's tea set, yeah. Again, I'm not going to have time to go through all these documents. One of the ones I really want to show here, though, because I think it's really cool that we have this, is her cookbook. Again, like just because we have that sense, right? One of the reasons I like this stuff so much, right, is that we got it from the family, right? So like you get this kind of stuff, like her cookbook. So it's loose, so I got to be careful how I hold it. But it's just, she took what's a ledger, it even says ledger on it. She just took a ledger, gutted it, and shoved all her recipes in it. So we know, we could cook these. We know some of Mary Harlan's recipes. Everybody guesses about Mary's white cake. We actually know what Mary Harlan, or at least some of the things that Mary Harlan would cook. And then I just picked some letters, again, which I'm not going to be able to go through them all. Just a Christmas card. Again, you just get these glimpses of them as a family. This is Hildene in the winter. I forget who she sends this to. I'm a little nervous to open it. There we go. Oh, we don't know this one. It just says, so she probably sent this to everybody, right? It just says, Mrs. Lincoln sends Christmas greetings and best wishes for the new year. Here she is writing to Jessie, her youngest, and she calls her Petticoat, right? Little cute things about this family. And then what was the last one I have? Oh, this I wanted to show. This is from the Civil War. So one of the things that her mother does during the war is minister to soldiers on the front. And she goes once in 62 or 63. In 64, she takes Mary Harlan with her. And that's what this is Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, issuing permission for the Harlans to cross into the war and minister. So, all right, let's get through the daughters real quick. So Mamie, I have no objects for Mamie. Our collection, and a lot of these letters actually still haven't been fully cataloged yet, so again, I'm just making a dent on things, but a lot of these photographs, again, I want to remind you, these photographs are in our collection. These are the actual Lincoln family photographs. I just digitized them because it's easier than showing them to you. So there's Mamie. We have all these kind of glamour shots of Mamie. But I'll tell you about her first. She is born on October 15th, 1869. She passes away on November 21st, 1938. When she was asked as a teen what it meant to be a Lincoln, she said it was an honor, but she considered herself just as much a Harlan. And rarely spoke about her grandmother, Mary Todd Lincoln. She has the typical qualities of an older sibling. She is kind of the dry and responsible one of the family. You'll see Jessie is much more flamboyant. She meets Queen Victoria when Robert becomes the minister to the court of St. James. Mamie, Jessie, Jack passes, that's where Jack gets sick, is over there. I'll go with them, and she is old enough. Jessie doesn't get to meet Victoria, I'll tell you that story in a second. But Mamie gets to meet Queen Victoria when they get over there. She marries Robert's private secretary, Charles Isham, who is related to the same family that Robert is partnering with in his law firm. They get married on September 2nd, 1891. They had formed a bond during Jack's passing. He's there and he comforts her during Jack's sickness. They move to New York City, and we know very little about them. They are very private, and they keep to themselves in New York. So here she is. Again, we have these glamour shots. Here she is in a kimono, looking at herself in a mirror. I'm assuming these were taken in either New York or in England. There she is with her son. She names her son Lincoln. That is Lincoln Isham. He goes by Link. Link is born on June 8th, 1892. You can't tell in that picture, but he is cross-eyed, although he eventually gets that fixed. He also has a very low profile like his mother, but he is basically a New York gentleman. You'll also see that these generations, this is the last generation, right? Lincoln is part of the last generation. The three members of the last generation, although we're going to talk about girls and not boys today, but they live idle kind of, lives of the rich. And that's what he does. He kind of becomes a New York socialite. He hangs out with Hemingway. Also shows mental illness. He goes to Harvard, but can't handle it, basically has a nervous breakdown while he's there, and has to leave. He gets married. He has no kids. Again, this last generation all don't have any children. Mamie inherits Hildene from, very controversially, Mamie inherits Hildene from her mother. Jessie doesn't get any of it. They skip Jessie, and it will go to Peggy after that. And she doesn't really live there until right before she dies, when she is 69. So there she is with Link. Here she is again with Link. She's the one who looks the most like her grandpa. And there she is with Jessie. So Jessie is born on November 6, 1875. She passed away on January 4th, 1948. I could talk about Jessie for this entire hour, and we're running out of time, so I'm not going to say that much, but Jessie is fascinating. Jessie, right, that's Jessie on the left, right? So I guess, you're right. So Jessie is not allowed to meet Queen Victoria because she's only 14, but she arranges a meeting with the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, because she is smitten by the idea of meeting a prince. And apparently, when he meets her, he's very gracious to her, and he tells her, he's in the foreign ministry, I think, is the building they're in, which makes sense, because that's, Robert is the diplomat. And he goes, you should tour the rest of this building and meet everybody else and see how it works. And apparently Jessie says something to him like, oh no, I just wanted to meet a prince, I'm fine, and then she leaves. So she attends Iowa Wesleyan, and she majors in music. And while she is there, she falls hard for the hunk of the football team, Warren the Dude Beckwith. His other nickname was the Lady Killer. And he's on the football team. He had previously been a pro baseball player, which is where he earned his nicknames. He tries out for the Cubs. And that's when his dad steps in and says, you better go to college. And that's how he ends up at Iowa Wesleyan. So he's already a pretty accomplished baseball player by the time he gets there. He will later play pro ball in Texas. That's before Major League Baseball. So he does play for a short time in Texas. But, spoilers, part of the story is that Warren never really gets his act together. And that leads to problems. She falls for him so hard that Robert and Mary find out, again, Robert and Mary, very conservative, they find out that she is dating a football player, and they are not happy about it, and want this relationship to end. Jessie is madly in love with him and attempts to elope with him at Iowa Wesleyan, and they go to see a clerk, and say, we're going to get married. And the clerk goes, okay, come back tomorrow. And Jessie writes her name, and he sees what her last name is, and he calls Robert. And Robert and Mary come to Iowa Wesleyan and remove Jessie from the college so she will not marry Warren. She's back in Chicago shortly thereafter and secretly arranges for Warren to meet her at the train station in Chicago. She tells Robert she tells Mary that she's going shopping. She meets him at the Northwestern train depot because he knows a minister in Milwaukee who will marry them. And so this is on November 10th. So she meets him at the train station I want to say around noon. They go to Milwaukee at 2:30. They get married. That's when he learns what her last name is, but he does it anyway. They get married. By 4 o'clock, she is back in Chicago and goes back to her parents' place. And she has promised Warren, they check into a hotel in Milwaukee in between there. She promises she promises Warren that she will tell her parents that she has done this. She does not. Just shows up at home like, well, I'm home from shopping. And Robert and Mary get tipped off by a reporter that she has in fact gotten married, and this is an enormous national scandal. All the papers show up suddenly at Robert's door the next day. They basically lay siege to the house in Chicago. Robert at this time has a mansion on the lakeshore in Chicago. And basically the house is surrounded by reporters for days while Robert has to weather this scandal. Warren is in Chicago, secretly in a hotel, and no one will tell him where, and Robert doesn't know either, and nobody will say where he is, and reporters are all trying to find him. Jesse is in the Lincoln mansion. It's all very high drama. Eventually, the Lincolns meet with the Beckwiths. Warren's dad is a Civil War veteran. He was an officer in the Civil War, so Robert and him have that in common. And they meet, and I basically work it out, and Jesse goes back to Iowa to live with Warren and finish her studies and cheer him on playing football. She gets pregnant by him. Peggy is born 9 months and 17 days after their wedding. And then Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith is born shortly thereafter. Again, I could just go on and on about this woman. But Warren never finds a job, and they end up getting divorced. He will always blame Mary Harlan for this, that Mary Harlan poisons Jesse against him and poisons the children against him. There are several times after their divorce where Warren tries to seek out Jesse and see his kids, and she refuses. He never sees his kids. After Jesse passes away, the newspapers go and find him. At that time, he's married to somebody else. And they go and find him. He's in California. Peggy and Bob Beckwith find out about this. And he says, I'd love to see them, and they don't seek him out. So becomes obviously a complicated situation, another sad situation. She lives in Georgetown, near her parents' house in Georgetown with the 2 kids as a single mother. There she ends up marrying 2 other men. She marries Frank Edward Ned Johnson, who is a watercolor artist, which will come into play later, and a member of a prominent Connecticut banking family. The Smithsonian, he's an explorer. Again, she's living this she's like a character in a romance novel, right, or a soap opera. He went to the Sahara to study cave dwellers there, Muslim cave dwellers, and became 3 National Geographic articles, so that's kind of his claim to fame. One article described him as appearing, quote, Adonis-like, so again, Jesse is hooking up with hunky guys, yeah. She, at 42, he asks Jesse, who at that time is 40, to marry him. And Warren finds out about this, and apparently there's all these, he reaches out through a friend to say that he still loves her, and there's all this drama. But they get married on June 22nd, 1915 at Hildene. And then he goes away again on one of his exploring things, and he returns to Washington to find out that there's another man living in his house with Jesse. His name is Robert Randolph. He is a descendant of the Randolph family, the Virginia Randolph family, one of the from Jamestown, the married, Pocahontas' second husband, right? It's that family. He is kind of a man of leisure, and they kind of live that life together. She marries him on December 26, 1926, after Johnson divorces her. he is broke despite his prominent family, and they keep borrowing from the trust that that Robert Todd Lincoln has left them, which causes some strain. Is probably why Jesse gets skipped in the will. There's some letters here, again, I'm not going to have time to get into them, from Mary Harlan about the will. And one of them, she talks about men who she's trying to avoid laying claim to her estate, and I think she's referring to Jesse's several husbands. They're also doing this during the Great Depression, by the way, too. They're spending extravagantly. I've already talked about Hildene. I do want to mention, so she does not inherit Hildene, but she does inherit the Lincoln's cars. Again, they're a wealthy family. This is the 20s. Cars are not common. She inherits Lincoln's cars, and I was delighted to find out that one of the cars the Lincolns owned was a 1927 Lincoln sedan. So, because of course, right? In her declining years, she moves into Hildene with Peggy, who ends up, like I said, Mamie actually doesn't live in Hildene for very long. So when Mamie passes away, it goes to Peggy, and she takes care of Jesse in her declining years. So this is the Virginia home, Woodstock, where she lives with Randolph. That's where she spends most of her time, and where a lot of the Lincoln's money, that trust money, goes into building. This is an old plantation. There's the veranda, the rear. I love this. That's her passport. We have two of her passports. Again, I love these intimate items. So, so here she is. This is her 1930 passport, which I forget if it's that one or not. Let me find her picture. No, this is her. That's 25. This is 30. I don't have a picture of that, but she's a lot older than this one, wearing a nice little jaunty hat. And this is her and Randolph, again, spending this money. They're traveling, all over Europe. In that one, she's Johnson, though, right? Isn't she? Yeah, she's still Johnson in that one. See, Jessie lived a life. There she is. That's the second passport photo. Okay, good. I did have it. There she is with Peggy. And there's the picture we started with. That's Mary, Mamie, and Peggy. Should I show you one of the letters? I love her letter to Bob. I found all these Christmas cards, so I don't know. I got drawn to them, and I pulled all these Christmas cards. What she says to Bob is really cute. Where is it? Here it is. This is Jessie. It's got a picture of some fellows riding on it. It says, "Gone away." And when you open it, it says, "Forever kisses to Muzzy," which is Bob. Christmas 1940. So I think Jessie was probably adorable. Oh, I wanted to show this too. Another thing this family all have in common, which again, you probably know a little bit of if you spent time here, is they all love animals. Peggy, big time. And as you'll see. But this is Jessie's membership card to the Washington Animal Rescue League. I was so touched when I found this because Abe would have been a member if such a thing had existed. They love their dogs, especially. Of course, we know Abraham loved cats too. Peggy loves all kinds of animals, as you'll see. So let's talk about Peggy, and then we'll do some Q&A, and then you can go up and have a closer look at some of these objects. So Peggy is adorable. Peggy really heals the rift between Jessie and her parents. Mary Harlan will not stop writing about Peggy in her letters. Robert clearly adores Peggy. Their little granddaughter is the apple of their eye. She is born on August 22nd, 1898. She will pass away, as I said when we started, on July 10th, 1975, and she will be the last female Lincoln. She is born while Warren is off fighting in the Spanish-American War. but he gets a furlough to come home and see her. This is before they divorce, obviously. He gets a furlough to come and see her in Chicago. And apparently, upon seeing her, he is so taken with her that he runs out into the streets of Chicago and runs down the street demanding milk, screaming that it would be for Abraham Lincoln's great-granddaughter. So adorable. Again, I think Warren was probably adorable too. Bob, her brother, is born on July 19th, 1904. Bob, when asked what he does for a living later in life, will describe himself as a, quote, spoiled brat. Peggy loves Hildene, and that comes across in the letter. She's always there. Jessie is off gallivanting with her various beaus, and Peggy's real name is Mary. If I didn't say it earlier, she's the last Mary too, right? Jessie's actually Jessie's name, but Mamie is a Mary, of course, as well. She's the last Mary. She loves Hildene. She's there with Mary Harlan all the time. Mary Harlan, I think, essentially raises her. Robert buys her a pony when her parents divorce and she's sad. Robert buys her a pony, which I think is the source of her later love of animals. He also introduces her to golf, and this gives you a glimpse. So here's the deal with Peggy. Well, let's do some baby pictures first before I get to, there she is again. Again, this family, obviously, again, these are it. They have all these photographs, right? Like they're keeping these photographs of little Peggy. But there she is in her teenage years holding a gun. Peggy, and you get a little bit of a sense here of who Peggy becomes when she grows up. So she's wearing a dress in this picture. That is not something you will see very often. Peggy frequently dresses in pants and a shirt. She often wears men's clothing. She never marries. And she lives a life, so I'll let you conjecture from that. And Mary lives a life of leisure, but she pursues all kinds of things. Mary has an extremely varied life, and she gets involved in a lot of things. Golf is one of those first things. So Robert loved golf, right? Part of the reason Hildene gets built is Robert, with all this scandal, right? We haven't talked, I don't want this to be about Robert, but Robert has a lot of trauma in his life, obviously. He has this scandal, and I think part of what leads to Hildene is Robert goes, I'm going to go move out into the country where no one can find me next to a golf course. And there's all these photographs in our collection that I think I showed in a previous program of Robert golfing. Mamie took all those photos with her Kodak. And I love that he teaches Peggy to golf, and she gets pretty good. Apparently, she averaged 100. She goes to the Madeira Finishing School for girls in D.C., and then she never gets a job, though. She just goes to live at Hildene. Examples of things that she does. Here she is playing tennis. Again, looking a little girlish. You'll see that she eventually gets rid of most of her hair. Here she is driving a car. Notice who's riding in the car with her. 2 dogs. Peggy owns several cars, which she drove, which again is a rare thing at the time. She had those cars modified so her dogs could ride in the car with her. Among other pets Peggy has, when Peggy takes over Hildene, she just collects animals, again, which I think is something Abraham would have done if he'd been allowed to, but she even collects animals that you wouldn't really want to collect. So the most famous example of that is she allows 2 raccoons to live in Hildene, where they wreak havoc upon the house, and apparently the smell of their urine and things becomes so bad that even Peggy ends up upset about it and installs all this stuff to try to fight the smell. Like I said, I've never been to Hildene. I'll tell this quick story real quick. I've never been to Hildene, but I've met the people who work there at a conference, and they showed me this photograph that of a mantle at Hildene that has a raccoon on it. And they said, why did they have a statue of a raccoon on their mantle? And I said, that's not a statue. Peggy. She also flies. Peggy owned that plane. She learns how to fly in D.C. She apparently could execute a spiral climb, which I think I have an idea what that is. And this terrifies her grandmother, who thinks that Peggy will come to a bad end and that she's a Lincoln, and Lincoln shouldn't be doing something as dangerous as crashing a plane because she doesn't want the Lincoln line to end. Of course, joke's on her. Peggy never has any kids. When she is managing Hildene, at that point, it is bloated to become one of the largest employers in its area. And when she's home, she would sit on the, I guess there's a veranda on the back of the house, with a bullhorn and like shout orders through it at the staff. And if they weren't paying attention, she would play a bugle, so they would all stop at attention and listen to her. Over time, though, that staff declines. As they retire or whatever, she doesn't really replace them. She is a complicated figure. I won't go too deep into this, but the way she deals with the Lincoln legacy is by avoiding it. She does not embrace the Lincoln legacy at all. She says it's basically by luck. People ask her about Lincoln all the time, right? They say, how does it feel to be Abraham Lincoln's great-granddaughter? And she goes, I'm just related to him by luck. Doesn't matter. At what she avoids, she starts disappearing on February 12th, because she knows every February 12th, a reporter is going to drive up that driveway and find her. And so she eventually starts like making sure she's not there. In the 1960s, someone finally catches her about to leave Hildene, and she says some kind of regrettable things. They ask her how she feels about Lincoln, and I think that's when she says, well, it's just by luck I'm related to him, like whatever. And then they ask her how she feels about the civil rights movement, and she says she's not, because they go, wouldn't your grandfather would be so happy, or your great-grandfather would be so happy because of the civil rights movement? And she goes, I don't know what he would have thought. And personally, I think like animals should stay separated, different races should stay separated. So she obviously has a complicated political legacy as well. These are her watercolors. I mentioned that Johnson is a watercolor artist, so I wonder if he did these. I've picked 3 that kind of show her progress. My wife is an artist, and I had her look at them. I said, is Peggy any good? And she said, well, she's okay, but notice she gets better as she goes. So here's the first one. We don't know when she did these. Here's the second one. And here's the third one. And again, these are all in our collection. They were in the Treasures Gallery until very recently, for those of you who are here. Here she is feeding ducks. Yeah, in a dress, yeah. And there she is with one of her dogs, again in a dress, but notice her hair's gone. This is a little farm they make for her near Hildene, where she kind of lives on her own for a while before she gets back to Hildene. And there she is looking regal. There she is with Bob later in life. This is the last photograph we have of them. Again, there are others elsewhere. And there she is with her grandpa. I love that picture. Peggy, I will show you one thing, again, from Peggy's. This is a poem we think Peggy wrote, because we couldn't find it anywhere else. And notice she drew a little doggy. Because that's a little doggy on top, because that's what Peggy's all about. I wanted to finish with this letter. I didn't read it. There's actually one of the letters in here I probably should have read, is about how upset Peggy got when Robert died. Where it's Mary's describing after Robert's death that like Peggy basically like goes up into her room and like shuts herself in there, and how sad they both are, and that Mary didn't want Peggy to see her cry, and that Peggy didn't see her cry. It's a very moving letter. This is, I think, adorable. This is from 1903, so Peggy is very young, and she has clearly sent Robert. Where is Robert? Robert's in New York, and Peggy's in Chicago, and he is sending Peggy. She has clearly sent him a telegram, and he is responding. And he says, tell your grandma I'm very well. Ask her to telegraph about herself and Mama Jessie, Robert Todd Lincoln. So here, they loved this girl to pieces. So I love this picture of her with her grandpa, who adored her. So that's the Lincoln women. So I learned a lot. I think there's a lot more in this collection about these women, so I intend to continue to look into them, because I really found this an interesting program to put together. I hope you found it interesting too. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.